This video is about the telepathy experiment that I carried out, and the reason I did it is because it was based on an observation from something that happened years ago. So years and years and years ago I was a girl guide and we went on guide camp, and when we got there it rained and rained and rained and we were so bored, and we just basically sat around in our tents with nothing to do, and the guide leaders were like, oh, it's only a bit of rain, go outside, and we did a bit, but we were just drenched and miserable. So we spent a lot of time in our tent, and there were 4 of us in our tent. There was Carly, who was 16 and she was the oldest, and then there was Della, Emily and me. We were all 11, and those aren't their real names. So Carly was 16, and although she was like a lot older than us, we didn't really think she was cool. She was a little bit strange, really. But anyway, Carly had bought a ghetto blaster with her, and she bought 1 tape, which was the Michael Jackson Bad album, which was pretty big out at the time. So for the first day we learnt the entire words to the entire Bad album and did like dance routines that we could in a tent with not much space. And the one that really sticks in my mind was the one by the song called Dirty Diana. And every time I hear it now, I'm just like straight back in that rainy tent. And it kind of you might know it, it kind of goes, you'll never make me stay, so take your weight off of me. And it's all about this like woman, Dirty Diana, wants Michael Jackson to do rude stuff to him, I guess. But that's the song that really reminds me of guide camp. Anyway, after that day, the batteries on the ghetto blaster ran out. There was no internet, it was the 1980s, nothing to do, so we like played cards endlessly, and then we got bored with that. And then Carly said, why don't we play a different kind of game? And she said, why don't we play the telepathy game? And she had a rounders ball, and so she sat with her back to us and would hold the rounders ball. And the 3 of us, so Della, Emily and me, we would all sit like amongst ourselves, and we'd agree who Carly should throw the ball to. So if we said it was Emily, we wouldn't say Emily, we'd just point to Emily. And then Carly would turn around, hold the ball, and then Emily would be thinking, throw it to me, and me and Della would be going, throw it to Emily, in our minds, throw it to Emily, without looking at Emily. And then Carly would have to intuit who to throw the ball to, and then throw the ball to whoever, hopefully Emily. So that was the game. Yeah, I know, but it was 1988 or something, and it was nothing to do, lots of rain, and we were like, yeah, let's just do it. So we did that, and it went horribly. It was rubbish. Like, Carly kept throwing it to the wrong people, and we were like, this is rubbish. And then suddenly, obviously it's just probably due to chance, she actually threw it to the right person, and we all got quite excited, and we were like, oh, it's worked, when really it was probably due to chance. But the strange thing that happened after that was that the more that we did it, the better we got. So suddenly Carly kind of kept throwing it to the right person, and then we all swapped around and we had a go. And I remember when I was doing it, I was holding the rounders ball and it felt like it kind of burned in my hand. And I threw it to Della and hadn't even been thinking who to throw it to, and it was the right person. It was just really strange. And I remember thinking, something's going on here. So I just checked my notes on my laptop. Where are we up to? So we didn't actually record the number of times, but I felt sure something was going on. And so, is it possible to improve your telepathic ability just by practice, was the kind of idea in my mind. And I never forgot that experience. And then, like years later, obviously, I've become a psychology teacher, and I thought, actually, I'd like to test that observation scientifically and see whether you can actually improve your telepathic ability through practice. So with this in mind, I had to decide how I was going to conduct the experiment. And so I obviously wanted to get a group of participants, test them before any practice, then practice for, say, and I thought practice for 90 minutes, because that's called the BRAC, which is the basic rest activity cycle. You probably learned about in biopsychology. The BRAC means that we can do something for about 90 minutes and then we need a break and we're tired. So I thought practice for 90 minutes and then test again and see whether people's psychic ability had improved, their telepathic ability. And so I thought, how am I going to measure it? And I thought, well, I could use something called Zener Cards. So if you take a look at this picture, Zener Cards are a set of 25 cards, 5 of each design. The cards are shuffled, and then one person tries to intuit what is on each card to another using only the power of the mind. So if the card was the black square, the person would think black square, over and over to try to send that message telepathically to the other person. So let's try that now. I've got some Zener cards here, so I'm going to shuffle them up and pick one at random. So I've got one at random in front of me, and I'm going to look at it and I'm going to try and send you the message of what it is. So I'm going to think it in my mind. Have you got it? So the card is Red Cross. And some of you will be going, I got it, and some of you will be saying, I didn't get it. Maybe it's due to chance that you got it, maybe it isn't. Maybe you've got telepathic ability. So these are the Zener cards that I thought we could use. So of course with Zener cards, somebody could say black square, so one of them is a black square. You could actually just say black square for the entire time and still get 5 right. So with Zener cards, anything over 5 is seen as a significant score. So the next thing we need to do is create hypotheses. When you conduct an experiment, you write a hypothesis, and the hypothesis must include the independent and dependent variables. So the independent variable is the thing that changes, and the dependent variable is how you measure it. So in our experiment, the IV is before practice and after practice, and the DV is the number of correctly identified Zener cards. And it's not about guessing, it's about correctly identifying through intuition. So when you've got your IV and DV, you can write the hypotheses. And the first thing you do is write a null hypothesis. And that's to say there will be no difference in the number of correctly identified Zener cards before and after 90 minutes practice. So the null hypothesis is saying the IV is not going to cause a difference in the DV. And you start with that, and then from that you then write an alternate hypothesis, which can either be directional or non-directional. So I've chosen a directional hypothesis, and it says participants will correctly identify more Zener cards after 90 minutes practice than before 90 minutes practice. So once you have your hypotheses, you then have to think about control measures. How are you going to control your experiment? And a pilot study is a really good thing to do as a control measure. So a pilot study is a mini study before the real experiment, and it's not to test the hypotheses or the hypothesis at all, it's to test the materials and the apparatus that you're going to use. So in this instance, we'd make sure, are the actual Zener cards, are they the right size? Is 90 minutes the right amount of time to practice? And so you carry out the actual experiment, a mini version of the experiment, not to test the hypotheses, but to test the materials and the standardized instructions. And if you do it on a small, like this mini study, the people in it can ask you questions, and that helps guide your experiment. So when we did it, I went and recruited some volunteers from the local university who were psychology students, and they were going to help me run the experiment because I wouldn't be able to do it on all the participants, wouldn't have enough time. And so all the psychology students kind of did the pilot study, and we got together at the end and we all identified that 90 minutes was too long. So everyone got bored and tired, and that would invalidate the results because people would stop trying. And so it was agreed that we would have a 45-minute rest period, a 45-minute practice period, because that seemed long enough to be meaningful, but not too long that you'd get tired. So the next thing we needed to do was recruit the participants, and that's called a sample. And I used a volunteer sample by putting up posters on notice boards in places like doctors' surgeries, dentists, cafes, pubs, and I also put a poster up in the local fortune telling shop because I thought people who go there would be interested in it. And so the volunteer sample means that you put up the posters and then people respond to you, and there are enough details on the poster that people can make an informed choice as to whether they want to take part. And so a good thing about a volunteer sample is that it's more ethical because people self-select. But a bad thing about the volunteer sample is you get very highly motivated people respond, and so that group of people might be different to non-motivated people, so you always get a bit of a biased sample, but it seemed a good thing to do and it was ethical. The experimental design is repeated measures, and that's because all of the participants did both conditions of the IV. So each participant tried to correctly identify the Zener cards before practice and then again after 45 minutes practice. So with repeated measures, usually a control measure for that is counterbalancing, and that's where you get all your participants, split them in two, half the group do condition A followed by condition B, and the other half do condition B followed by condition A. And it controls for something called order effects, which are fatigue, practice, and boredom. And so because you're doing both conditions of the IV, your performance might actually increase or decrease because depending on the order you do the actual conditions of the IV. And that's why we kind of do the counterbalancing so that people do it in a different way. But we couldn't do counterbalancing for this experiment because we were actually trying to test whether practice improved your ability with telepathy. And you wouldn't be able to do condition B followed by condition A because condition B was after practice and condition A was before practice. So you wouldn't be able to do your Zener Cards after practice because the law of physics doesn't allow that. So we couldn't use counterbalancing. But we had got the pilot study as a control measure. We had standardised instructions as a control measure, which avoids investigator bias because everyone gets exactly the same instructions. And we also had a highly controlled environment. So we used like laboratory settings. We actually used some rooms within the university. They allowed us to use those. So those were our control measures, and that like helped to eliminate any extraneous variables and any other things that might pop up. So the experiment itself, well, the experiment, in a lot of respects, the experiment went really well, and the psychology students were exemplary. They really were very competent and they were very respectful. You know, we followed those 4 ethical principles of psychology, which are respect, integrity, confidentiality, and competence. And those are really important ethical considerations. And they also adhered to all the BPS guidelines as well. And they collated and collected the results of the experiment very well and ready for statistical analysis, which I'll talk about a bit later. But before I talk about the statistical analysis, there were a few strange things that went on in the experiment and things that I feel like I should probably go into in a bit more detail. So there was one participant who stood out right from the beginning, and I'll call her Kaz. It's not her real name, but we'll call her Kaz. And when I got to the reception where all the participants were waiting to be randomly allocated and get standardised instructions and stuff, I walked in and most people were kind of like engrossed in their phones or, you know, might be making general chit chat to each other. But Kaz was actually, she wasn't doing that. She had engrossed a couple of people in something called psychometry and was practicing it in the waiting room. So I first heard of psychometry when I lived in Australia and I was a receptionist in a call centre, and the management team there were all quite young and trendy, and they were into this thing called psychometry, and it's where you get an item that belongs to somebody, like a watch or a ring or something personal, and you hold it in your hands and then you can intuit details about that person from the item. And so I was a bit dubious about it because one of the managers called Joe, he wanted to do it on me, and I was like, go on then. So I gave him my watch and he held my watch and for ages and ages and ages, and it got a bit like embarrassing. And then he said, oh, I can't do it, there's a block. And I thought, oh yeah, a block, like, what do you want about? So I was like, all right, yeah, okay. And so I kind of dismissed psychometry. I've just remembered something else actually, a bit weird, that was my day job working in the call centre. And my nighttime job was a waitress in a nice restaurant. And I remember I was looking at the board, looking at all the orders on the board. And you know, sometimes you can feel people watching you. And I thought, oh, just felt like someone was watching me. And then I felt a hand on my shoulder. And it kind of sent this, almost like a bolt of electricity down my spine. And I was like, what's that? And I turned round and there was Joe who worked at the call centre, the guy who tried to do the psychometry. But he wasn't right behind me. He was like way over on the other side of the restaurant, but he was looking at me, and it just made me feel a bit weird, really. I'd forgotten all about that. Anyway, I'd forgotten all about psychometry when I came back to England, hadn't heard of it again until I walked into the reception. There's Kaz, and she got an antique ring, but that belonged to another participant, and we'll call the participant Chantal. So she got the ring, and she was holding the antique ring, and she was telling Chantal all these really personal details about Chantal's grandmother, who had owned the ring. And Chantal's grandmother had recently passed away, and Chantal had inherited the ring, and so she was holding the ring, and she was telling her details about her grandmother. So I pretended not to be listening, but I was like fiddling around doing paperwork, but I was listening, and the details were like really specific. It wasn't like, oh, your grandma had a friend called John or anything. It was your grandmother, like, she loved Pontefract cakes. Weird. Your grandmother, she told her the exact wedding date that her grandmother had got married, like the exact date. And she told her the address that like the name of the street that her grandmother had grown up on. And so it was just really, really specific. And I thought, this is going to hijack the whole experiment, really. And so I just ignored it and started saying to everybody, I was like, oh, we're going to hand out consent forms now and do standardised instructions. And so most people then started doing their consent forms. So I wasn't really sure whether I should allow Chantal or Kaz really to carry on with the experiment, because Chantal was obviously really upset by what had happened, hearing all these really personal details about her grandmother who had recently passed away. And it just was really quite strange. So when they were filling in the consent forms, I noticed that Kaz actually had a bit of almost like a wry smile on her face. I swear she did. At the same time that Chantal, as she was like filling out the consent form, this like huge tear just like splashed onto the consent form and smudged her signature. And I felt she was obviously really emotional, but I swear that Kaz had this kind of almost like a wry smile about it. And I thought, what's going on here? Anyway, while I was collecting the consent forms, I heard Chantal asking Kaz how she got into psychometry in the first place. And Kaz said that when she was little, her mum used to play psychic games with her. And my ears pricked up and I was like, oh my gosh, is her mum going to be Carly, who I used to know from guides back in the 10? I thought, no, it can't be. But we are from a very small town. It's the kind of town where if you add somebody new on Facebook, you've got 22 mutual friends. It's that kind of place, you know, like there's so many connections. So I know I shouldn't have, but I said to her, oh, well, what kind of games did you play with your mum? Anyway, I was quite relieved because she mentioned nothing about rounders balls. She just said about like playing cards, like normal playing cards, like trying to intuit what the suit was and what the actual card was. And I'm not going to lie, I was actually quite relieved. And then I thought, why? Why am I relieved? And I just had this bad feeling. And if I believed in auras, which I don't, but if I did, then Kaz would have had this horrible aura, something that just didn't feel quite right, something I couldn't put my finger on. It just didn't feel right. So I didn't ask them to withdraw. Chantal had kind of pulled herself together, and so we did the next part of the experiment to randomly allocate each participant to an experimenter, and it had to be random allocation. But the person that I got paired with was Kaz, and you just kind of know that's going to happen, which is silly because that's what the whole experiment is about. And I thought, and she knew as well, like she gave me the look, and I thought, well, that's weird. So then I had to spend the next hour or so with Kaz. So I was actually really interested, and I thought, here's someone who maybe does have telepathic ability, and I thought maybe she's going to have this amazing telepathic ability right from the start as well, and then maybe she won't even improve because she's already telepathic. But she did horribly. She did really badly. She got 1 out of 25 before practice, and she was fuming, and you could see that she was fuming, and she was kind of like laughing it off, but kind of accused me of lying about the results. So I assured her of the BPS guidelines, and I said, like, I've got to have integrity and there can't be any deception, and I'd like to remind you you've got the right to withdraw at any time, because you can't allow people to feel upset or psychologically harmed or angry. But she was okay, she laughed it off. And then we started doing the practice, and after about 20 minutes she wasn't improving at all, which was obvious to both of us. And then she stopped and she got quite angry, and she said, this isn't working, I need to do psychometry, that's how I practice telepathy. And she said she wanted my engagement ring to hold and tell me all about myself. And I was like, no, because 1, costs £3,500, I don't want to take it off. 2, then it would invalidate the actual experiment because we'd be doing a different kind of telepathic practice. But 3, I just didn't want her to have it. I just didn't trust her, and I just thought, no, I don't want you to. So I kind of laughed it off and said, oh, well, it would invalidate the experiment. So she was like, okay. And so we carried on with the cards, and she did seem to get a bit better. But when we came to doing the actual test after the 45 minutes practice, she only got 3 out of 25. And again, she was like fuming. And she didn't even stick around for the debrief afterwards to kind of make sure that we'd already told them the aims and purposes of the study, which is what a debrief is partly for. But we obviously do a debrief to make sure everyone's okay and everyone leaves the study in the same way they arrived. But she just legged it before the debrief. So I was like, great, I can't even use the results now really, because in the debrief you always say, you've still got the right to withdraw, and I hadn't done any of that, so I thought I can't really use the results. Anyway, I got home and I realised my engagement ring was missing off my finger, and I just thought, it's Kaz, isn't it? I thought, she's some kind of con artist, she's like got my ring off me. It all just felt a bit weird, and because it's insured, I rang the police to get a report number, from the police. And I mentioned about Kaz, and they said, they looked her up and said there was nothing on her on the system, but they would definitely go around and have a chat. And then they rang me back and said that the address that she'd given didn't exist. And there was no they didn't have any records of the actual name. So I had a look on social media and looked her up, which I wouldn't ordinarily do. And there was just no mention, there was no internet footprint, nothing. And I thought, this is weird. Why has she taken part in this experiment, not given her real name and address, got off before the debrief? It just weirded me out. I just felt really uncomfortable. And the other bit that I've just forgotten, the really weird bit, was that when we were practicing, at one point she started humming Dirty Diana, the song that we had, the song that takes me right back, immediately transports me back to that tent in the field in the rain of playing that first psychic game. And it's probably just coincidence, but it's not like a up-to-date song or anything. And so the whole thing, I was quite glad actually that she'd gone and I could just take out her data. So I had taken out the data of her. So that meant, sorry, I just checked my notes. So blah, 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 the data. Yeah, so it left us with 18 sets of data instead of 19 because we had to remove Kaz's. And I performed a Wilcoxon T-Test on the data because it was a test of difference, which means we were testing the difference in the conditions of the IV. It was ordinal data, and that means that the Zener Cards, when we counted up the Zener Cards, how many Zener Cards did you get right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of 25. That gave us a number, but the number had no specific unit of measurement, which you would, so for interval or ratio data, you have a specific unit of measurement between the actual numbers. So time in seconds or degrees in centigrade. That would be a specific unit of measurement, whereas Zener Cards is ordinal data because there's no specific unit of measurement, but it is numerical. So the Wilcoxon T-Test is a test of difference, ordinal data, and it was a repeated measures design, which means you select the Wilcoxon T-Test. We couldn't do a parametric test because the data was only ordinal, because it was the Zener Cards. The data, in order to do a parametric test, we would have had to have had interval or ratio data, and then we would have selected the related T-test, I'm sure you know. So we did the test, and the calculated value of T was 47, and the critical value of T was 33. The calculated value needed to be the same as or less than the critical value to be significant, and it wasn't. So P is greater than 0.5, and that means there's a greater than 5% probability that our results are due to chance, and that means that we cannot say that our experiment was significant for a one-tailed test at the P is the same as or less than 0.05 level. And in layman's terms, that means that we have to accept the null hypothesis. So there is no difference in people's telepathic ability before practice and after 45 minutes practice. So the results of the experiment were not significant. And what that means is I hypothesised that if you practiced your telepathy skills that you would improve them, but the actual experiment found that wasn't the case. However, I can criticise the external validity of the experiment itself. So external validity, as you know, refers to can you apply the results of the experiment to the real world? And the first thing we can criticise is the mundane realism. So mundane realism refers to the task in the experiment. And the task that I used was to use Zener Cards. But how often in life do you sit around playing Zener Cards with people? And the answer is probably never. And so the actual task is quite a fake thing to do. If you think about telepathy in the real world, it tends to be when two people text each other at the same time, or something like that. And so if we had used a task that was more true to life, perhaps our results would have been significant, so perhaps our results were just not valid. The other thing we can criticise is the ecological validity of the experiment. So ecological validity, as you know, it refers to the setting in which the experiment takes place. And our experiment took place in a laboratory setting which was highly controlled, which was good for internal validity, but it's really, really fake, and it might put people on edge, and it might actually invalidate the results of the experiment. So if we'd used a more real-life setting, so something like perhaps a fortune teller's shop, or even if you were at home and just practicing and feeling relaxed at home or something like that, then maybe our results would have been significant. So even though I've said the experiment showed that telepathy can't be practiced, maybe in real life.
As I look into those eyes, I see those lies you keep from me. Now I realize those truths you hide, yet still it's never forgotten what you mean to me. Can I hold on now? Just wait and see. If I stay